All right, in 2006, American companies had a $64 billion problem. Can anyone guess what that problem was? It was that companies were failing to keep their employees. People were leaving the workplace as a result of unfair treatment. And every time a person left, that cost a company money. So you start compiling when people leave, and you start compiling the amounts of money that companies combined were losing. That came to the tune of $64 billion. Now, just to give you a sense of what $64 billion looks like, if you were to combine the annual revenues of Google, Goldman Sachs, Amazon.com, Microsoft, and Starbucks, that gets you to almost $64 billion. So companies started to wise up, and they realized that they needed to do more work, that they needed to start looking at why were people leaving as a result of unfair treatment? What were some of the things that were causing people to leave the workplace? When you look at the Department of Labor statistics, it also shows that there's really a schism between the number of people that are in our workforce and the people who are leaving our workforce. Women currently make up about 40% of our workforce. However, women only make up about 7% of executive level managers. People of color, we make up about 15% of our workforce. However, we only make up about 3 to 5% of executive level managers. So even though you've got the talent there, for some reason, they're just not staying. So when I started thinking about this question of how do you get managers to understand, how do you start treating employees a lot better? We've had diversity training for a number of years. We've been talking about diversity for about 20 some odd years. What's a different way that we can start getting people to relate to each other? And I went back to a conversation I had with a law firm partner back when I was doing a training in Louisiana. And he asked me with a very sincere voice, you know, we've been trying to hire more African Americans and women, but for some reason, we just can't keep them. How do you keep them, was his question. How do you keep them? How do you keep them? As he asked me that question, even though I understood that he sincerely meant all the best, it made me a bit uncomfortable because I wondered if he referred to these African American and women associates as them, just how integral do they feel to the firm? Do they ever feel like a we or an us because he referred to them as a them? So I started thinking, how do I get this law firm partner? And he happened to be a 60-year-old white gentleman. How did I get the 60-year-old white male partner to understand and to relate to and to identify with the young women and African American associates that he was hiring? How would I get him to understand what their experiences might be in the workplace? Because oftentimes, when we can relate to each other, we can identify with each other. And when we can identify with each other, that often makes for a better relationship. We often treat each other a lot better. So I started thinking, what's the common denominator experience? What's the common ground that this 60-year-old partner might have with his newer associates? When you think about it, most of us have felt like a person in the minority from time to time. You may have been at a meeting where you were the only guy in the room. You may have been at a meeting where you were the only person of color in the room. You may have been to an organizational function and where you found out that, you didn't really share too many characteristics with the people like you. Because you were the new person in the organization, people might not have been too warm and fuzzy with you. You were that person in the minority. Until this day, I know that I felt like a person in a minority. And when I go to meetings and conferences and functions, and I notice that there's someone in the room who might not feel as though they share the same gender, race, or any other characteristic with the other people in the room, I make an effort to reach out to them. Because tapping into my own feelings of being a person in the minority really guides how I treat the next person. Let's go back to 1983. That's when I was at my peak, the person in the minority. 1983, growing up in Westboro, Long Island. Everyone in Long Island has a bicycle. Now, it must have seemed like we had about 100 kids in my neighborhood. There were kids on my block around the corner. There were kids who would come in from the neighboring communities, all to play kickball. We had a great time. However, there was one thing that separated me from all of my friends. And it was that I outweighed all of my friends by about 50 pounds. Yeah, that's right, I was a chubby kid. I was that kid who was the fat kid in the neighborhood. I must have outweighed everyone, and everyone knew it. And there were times when people would let me know that I definitely didn't belong, that I wasn't the skinny kid, just like everybody else. I even had a theme song. When I come out of my house, some of the kids would start singing this song. Chunky's back and she's bigger than ever. That was my theme song. And even though it made me feel uncomfortable, and even though I was embarrassed, I still played with them. So till this day, when I see someone who might find themselves in the minority, I take an extra step to really go out and reach out to them and make sure that they feel much more welcomed, because I know what it feels like to be a person in the minority. See, that's the key to increasing diversity in today's corporations and law firms and educational institutions. When we can tap into our feelings of being a person in the minority, that may guide us in a way that we not just sympathize with other people, but we empathize. We'll understand what that person's going through. The only Latino in the office, the only woman in the office, the only older person, the only person from the LGBT community, the only person with a disability. If we tap into our feelings of what they may encounter because they are the only person with a particular characteristic, that might guide us in treating them better, making more efforts to reach out to them, and really making them more of an us as opposed to a them. So, in my book, I talk about some of the barriers that people commonly encounter when they are a person in the minority. After conducting research and talking to a number of people who gave me their testimonials in my book, Recruiting and Retaining a Diverse Workforce, New Rules for a New Generation, I found that basically there were 10 experiences that we encounter when we do find ourselves in the minority. So during today's session, we're going to start talking about what are some of those top 10 issues, what are some of those barriers that we do encounter, and we'll start practicing ways in which we can tear down those barriers when other people put them up for us, and also how we can tear down those barriers when we put them up for other people.